Hey guys, it's NJ Gloiper. We're back and we're reading Sources of Power by Gary Klein. Today we're reading chapter 4, The Power of Intuition. And we just finished up chapter 3. We talked about the RPD, the recognition primed decision model. So now we're going to get into how the intuition, or at least the power of intuition, like how to draw on it, how to foresee whether you're using intuition or whether you're using analytics or analysis to come up with your conclusions. So let's jump right in. This one's pretty long, so I'm only going to do one chapter today. And we'll try and do Tuesdays and Thursdays. I think those are the days that work best for me. So Tuesdays and Thursdays at 8 p.m. EST. But anyways, let's get into it. The power of intuition. Intuition depends on the use of experience to recognize key patterns that indicate the dynamics of the situation. Because patterns can be subtle, people often cannot describe what they noticed or how they judged a situation as typical or atypical. Therefore, intuition has a strange reputation. Skilled decision makers know that they can depend on their intuition, but at the same time, they feel uncomfortable trusting a source of power that seems so accidental. These are some names. I'm going to read them off and then I'll spell them. Beccara, B-E-C-H-A-R-A, Damasio, D-M-A-S-I-O, and Tranel, T-R-A-N-E-L. In 1997, found that intuition has a basis in biology. They compared patients who were brain damaged to a group of normal subjects. So Twitter users versus normies. The brain damaged subjects lacked intuition, an emotional reaction to anticipated consequences of good and bad decisions. In the normal subjects, the system seemed to be activated long before they were consciously aware that they had made a decision. This chapter will describe the research we have done to understand how intuition is used during decision making. It will describe studies with tank platoon leaders, U.S. Navy officers, and nurses, as well as fireground commanders. The nurse section is actually pretty interesting. The U.S. Navy officers one, I want to read more about that one. We'll get into it. There's a story about an incoming missile attack and how it's thwarted through intuition. For the first formal interview that I did in our first research project with firefighters, I was trying to find some difficult incident where my interviewee, a fireground commander, had to make a tough decision. He could think of only one case years ago where he said his extrasensory perception had saved the day. And he keeps talking about ESP, like the people he interviewed feel like they have some kind of like sixth sense or like ESP, and that's what allows them to choose the right decision in the moment or perceive some pattern that's not like consciously recognizable. But he debunks that. He's a debunker. So I tried to get him to think of a different incident because the one he had in mind was too old, because he was only a lieutenant then and not a commander, and because I don't have much interest in ESP. But he was determined to describe this case, so I finally gave up and let him tell his story. Example 4.1, the sixth sense. It's a simple house fire in a one-story house in a residential neighborhood. The fire is in the back, in the kitchen area. The lieutenant leads his hose crew into the building to the back to spray water on the fire, but the fire just roars back at them. Odd, he thinks. The water should have more of an impact. They try dousing it again and get the same results. They retreat a few steps to regroup. The lieutenant then starts to feel as if something isn't right. He doesn't have any clues. He just doesn't feel right about being in that house. So he orders his men out of the building, a perfectly standard building with nothing out of the ordinary. And as soon as his men leave the building, the floor where they had been standing collapses. Had they still been inside, they would have plunged into the fire below. A sixth sense, he assured us, and part of the makeup of every skilled commander. Some close questioning revealed the following facts. He had no suspicion that there was a basement in the house. He didn't suspect that the seat of the fire was in the basement, directly underneath the living room where he and his men were standing when he gave his order to evacuate. But he was already wondering why the fire didn't react as expected. The living room was hotter than he would have expected for a small fire in the kitchen of a single-family home, and it was very quiet. Fires are noisy, and for a fire with this much heat, you would have expected a great deal of noise. The whole pattern didn't fit right. His expectations were violated. He realized he did not quite know what was going on. So a lot of times when people have these instincts, it's not the whole situation that's the problem. It's not the house and the floor and the basement not being there or the fire roaring back at them. It's not all of the pieces put together. It's just a sense. It's just like an unconscious feeling. And if you remember back to what Daniel Kahneman was talking about in Thinking Fast and Slow, a lot of these pattern recognition systems are unconscious. They're not conscious. And what we know about the unconscious is that it's very difficult to articulate what is actually going on in your subconscious. Obviously, because it's below consciousness, like that's just obvious. But even if you do think back on it consciously afterwards, it's very difficult to articulate. Those processes are not something that you do, I guess, voluntarily. That's probably the best way to say it. It's almost like reactive. It's almost completely done without your conscious knowing. So it's the pieces of the puzzle added together. That's the part that the unconscious is doing that makes a situation feel wrong. That's that ESP. That's that sixth sense. So it's not the whole situation, and it's not just one part of it. It's like the parts. The sum of the parts is greater than the whole. It's like the synthesis of those things that set you off and make you feel like something's wrong. That's the important part. So that's why he ordered his men out of the building. With hindsight, the reasons for the mismatch were clear. Because the fire was under him and not in the kitchen, it was not affected by his crew's attack, and the rising heat was much greater than he had expected. And the floor acted like a baffle to muffle the noise, resulting in a hot but quiet environment. This incident helped us understand how commanders make decisions by recognizing when a typical situation is developing. That's the key word, typical. It's like prototypical, the platonic situation of a fire in a residential home. What does that look like? In this case, the events were not typical. So there was some kind of discrepancy. There was something that didn't fit the model that he had essentially been trained on. His reaction was to pull back, regroup, and to try to get a better sense of what was going on. So observation, observing and taking notes of each particular aspect of the situation. By showing us what happens when the cues do not fit together, the synthesis of the parts, that he's just like hammering this home. This case clarified how much firefighters rely on a recognition of familiarity and prototypicality. By the end of the interview, the commander could see how he had used the available information to make his judgment. I think he was proud to realize how his experience had come into play. Even so, he was a little shaken since he had come to depend on his sixth sense to get him through difficult situations, and it was unnerving for him to realize that he might never have had ESP. So this is a guy who he's like, someone tells him he's lucky, and he's like, yeah, I am lucky. And he's like scared. he's like narrowly avoiding disaster. It reminds me a little bit of like Forrest Gump. Like, oh man, dude, you're like a lucky guy. He's like, yeah, I guess so. Just like walking by like explosions, narrowly avoiding falling it like off a cliff, like Acme style. Looney Tunes. The commander's experience had provided him with a firm set of patterns. He was accustomed to sizing up a situation by having it match one of these patterns. He may not have been able to articulate the patterns or describe their features, but he was relying on the pattern matching process to let him feel comfortable that he had the situation scoped out. Nevertheless, he did not seem to be aware of how he was using his experience because he was not doing it consciously or deliberately. He didn't realize there were other ways he could have sized the situation up. He could see what was going on in front of his eyes, but not what was going on behind them, so he attributed his experience to ESP. This is one basis for what we call intuition, recognizing things without knowing how we do the recognizing. In the simple version of the RPD model, we size the situation up and immediately know how to proceed, which goals to pursue, what to expect, how to respond. We are drawn to certain cues and not others because of our situation awareness. And there's a side note, the author says, try to imagine going through a day without making any of these automatic responses. And obviously that's impossible. There may be other aspects of intuition that the one I have been describing. So he's saying that intuition isn't just like subconscious, and it's not just recognizing patterns. I do know that the firefighter's experience enables them to recognize situations quickly. Many people think of intuition as an inborn trait, something we are born with. I am not aware of any evidence showing that some people are blessed with intuition and others are not. My claim in this chapter is that intuition grows out of experience. All right, and I have this section highlighted, so this is the important part. We should not be surprised that the commander in this case was not aware of the way he has used his or had to use his experience. Rather than giving him specific facts from memory, the experience affected the way he saw the situation. So your perception is modified and altered by your own experiences. The way you see the world, the way you interact with the world, the way you goal seek. He just labeled those things. He just came up with a list. He was just reading them off. He said, which goals to pursue, what to expect, and how to respond. Those things are all shaped by experience, and it's not an inborn trait. It's not something you're born with. So the experience affected the way he saw the situation. So the world around him was shaped by his experience. Think about that. Another reason that he could not describe his use of experience was that he was reacting to things that were not happening rather than reacting to things that were. A third reason that he was unaware of his use of experience was that he was not drawing on his memory for any specific previous experience. A large set of similar incidents had all blended together. Again, we're talking about prototypical. We're talking about a synthesis of aspects of situations. It always goes back to the language models, because we're just modeling how we think with language models. He's talking about a large synthesis, a large data set, and it's all being blended together to create one like prototypical, example, like the Platonic example of something. So of some situation. And that means that all aspects are exactly what you'd expect to be of any example, any given example. So it's like the perfect example. That's what comes to your mind when you are an expert. You can think of the Platonic example and extrapolate all situations, or like read some situation into that Platonic example. So, and you could think of it like a ball rolling down a hill. As the ball rolls, it gets closer to the lowest point in the hill. So experience is like nudging the ball in some direction, and it may be up the hill, maybe down the hill, but where an expert lies is at the bottom, at the hill, at the lowest point in the valley. The ball has moved and it cannot go any further down. It's like at the lowest point. It has reached minimum error. And every time you see an example or you have some experience in the real world, you're pushing the ball in some direction. It may be a good example. It may be a good learning experience. You may learn nothing from that experience, and the ball might not move at all. But most of the time, the ball moves somewhere. And as long as you learn something from it, as long as you're like taking the right, you're getting the right lesson from the example, the ball moves towards that lowest point. And that's learning. That's basically how the large language models are trained, by the way. You're looking for the minimum of some domain. But yeah, that's the way you can think of experience and how an expert thinks. They're at the bottom of the hill. They've seen everything. There's no place on that valley that the ball hasn't been. And it's at the lowest point. It can't go anywhere else. It's seen all the other points. There are reasons why decision makers have trouble describing their intuition. Even researchers have problems with this concept. For example, in 1978, Lee Beach, Leebeach, and Terry Mitchell, Terrymitchell, presented a contingency model of decision making, arguing that the type of strategy a person uses will change depending on the context of the decision task. Sometimes people use the rigorous analytical methods, but sometimes they rely on non-analytical methods. And this is a funny part. Beach and Mitchell had no trouble explaining what they meant by rigorous analytical methods, and they could point to a number of techniques being studied at the time. However, when they wanted to explain what they meant by non-analytical methods, they came up short. They suggested things like gut feeling and tossing a coin, and even going eeny, meeny, miny, mo. So scientists, researchers, they don't live in the world of intuition. They don't live in the world of experience. Actually, experience is left out of the room when you're doing science or you're doing any kind of research. But he's telling you right now that is an analytical method. Your experience isn't nothing, and it's not worth nothing in science, but it can't be part of the analysis of like reproducing the thing, because everyone's experience is different. It's totally subjective. But maybe it can influence how you research something, or how you come up with a hypothesis, or how you goal seek. Now, we can say that at least some aspects of intuition come from the ability to use experience to recognize situations and know how to handle them. Described in this way, intuition doesn't sound very mysterious. In fact, the simple version of the RPD model is a model of intuition. And if you look in my post history, let me go find it. I'll just post it to the Jumbotron. Let me go to my profile. I'll post the model, the thing that Gary Klein posted himself. It's actually pretty useful for thinking about this stuff. It's a lot of abstract stuff talking about it, like experience and intuition, which, again, he just said it's like not mysterious when you talk about it, but when you think about it, it's a little weird. But all right, so I just posted that to the Jumbotron. That's his model of recognition prime decision, which is the model of intuition. It's like a simple model of it anyways. Intuition is an important source of power for all of us. Nevertheless, we have trouble observing ourselves using experience in this way. And we definitely have trouble explaining the basis of our judgments when someone else asks us to defend them. Therefore, intuition has a bad reputation compared with a judgment that comes from careful analysis. In fact, research by Wilson and Schooler is literally school with ER at the end, in 1991 shows that people do worse at some decision tasks when they're asked to perform analyses of the reasons for their preferences or to evaluate all the attributes of the choices. And we know this. We know this because people are terrible at rationalizing things. We are not rational beings as much as we want to be. A lot of our analysis is done by substitution of a harder analysis with an easier one, or by doing the analysis without actually doing any analysis, which means just like coming up with a gut instinct or like choosing the first option that comes to your head. So yeah, the fact that people are not analyzing all the choices in front of them all the time, yeah, that checks out. That makes total sense. And of course, intuition is not fallible, is not infallible. Our experience will sometimes mislead us, and we will make mistakes that add to our experience base. Imagine that you're driving around in an unfamiliar city and you see some landmark, perhaps a gas station, and you say, "Oh, I know where we are." And despite the protests of your spouse, who has the map, make a fateful turn and wind up on an unescapable entrance ramp to the highway you had been trying to avoid. As you face the prospect of being sent miles out of your way, you may lamely offer that the gas station you remembered must have been a different one. "I thought I recognized it, but I guess I was wrong." Yeah, limp. Just own up to your mistake. The fireground commanders we studied were aware that they could misperceive a situation. Even the commander who thought he had ESP did not make a habit of counting on it. The commanders rely on their expectancies as one safeguard. And by the way, we're about to get to the good example. This one is about the HMS Gloucester and the incoming missile. If they read a situation correctly, the expectancies should match the events. If they are wrong, they can quickly use their experience to notice anomalies. In the example of the vertical shaft fire, the commander walked out of the building as soon as he heard that the fire had spread beyond the second floor. He needed to get another reading about what was happening to the building. The commander who thought he had ESP was so discomfited with his expectancies, when his expectancies were violated, that he pulled his crew out of the building. These decision makers could formulate clear expectancies based on their experience so that early in the sequence they could detect that they had gotten it wrong. And that's okay. That's what he's saying, is that it's okay to have bad intuitions the first time, especially the first time, because you don't have all the data. He's talking about how he needed to get another reading. He had to walk into the building to figure out what was wrong. And usually your first gut instinct is correct if you're an expert. But what if you're not? That's where you do your learning. You make mistakes. And that's what people mean by like failing upwards, or like fail, and then you win, or whatever, these influencers talking about, failing towards success or whatever. It's all about gaining experience, but experience means nothing if you don't learn from it, if you don't synthesize it into a coherent, new goal seeking pattern, or shape your worldview in a positive direction from your negative experiences. So while you are gaining experience, and experience is valuable, it's not the end goal. You have to make something of the experience. So firefighters are not the only ones who confuse intuition and experience with ESP. Naval officers also do it. So here's the story. Example 4.2, the mystery of the HMS Gloucester. In February 1992, I heard about a curious incident in which the HMS Gloucester, a British Type 42 destroyer, was attacked by a silkworm missile near the end of the Persian Gulf War. This officer was in charge of air defense, and he believed strongly that the radar contact was a hostile missile, not a friendly aircraft, seconds after first detection, and before the identification procedure had been carried out, even though the radar blip was indistinguishable from an aircraft, and the U.S. Navy had been flying airplanes through the same area. The officer could not explain how he believed that this was a silkworm missile. The experts who looked at the recordings later said there was no way to tell them apart. Nevertheless, he insisted that he knew, and he shot the object down. At the time, his captain was not so confident. We watched the videotape of the radar scope and listened to the voices. When the radar blip is destroyed, the captain asks hesitantly, "Whose bird was it?" That is, who shot the missile that destroyed the unknown track? The anti-air warfare officer nervously replies, "It was ours, sir." So they're both like, what the hell did we just do? They're both like almost trying to like remove their own culpability. Like, who did that? Bro, you're the captain. Like, you should be knowing what's going on in your ship. For the next 4 hours, the HMS Gloucester sweats out the possibility that they shot down an American plane. The mystery of the HMS Gloucester was how the officer knew it was a Silkworm missile, not an aircraft. In July and August in 1993, I conducted a workshop on cognitive task analysis interviews for George Brander, a human factors specialist at the Defense Research Agency in the United Kingdom. Brander arranged to have us practice the methods with actual naval officers. One of them was Lieutenant Commander Michael Riley, the anti-air warfare officer on the Gloucester who spotted the Silkworm. So this is the actual guy. He had an interview with this guy, which is pretty crazy. It's pretty remarkable. Let me take a drink here real quick. We expected that Riley would be tired of going over the incident, but we found just the reverse. He was still puzzling it out, and he suggested to us that we focus our session around the Silkworm attack. Yeah, you can imagine playing that one over and over in your head. You shoot down a missile that looks indistinguishable from, like maybe not a civilian, but like an allied military plane. How do you know? How could you have known? The facts were simple. The Gloucester was stationed around 20 miles off the coast of Kuwait, near Kuwait City. The Silkworm missile was fired around 5 in the morning. As soon as he saw it, Riley believed it was a missile. He watched it closely for around 40 seconds until he had gathered enough information to confirm his intuition. Then he fired the Gloucester's own missiles and brought the Silkworm down. The whole incident lasted only around 90 seconds, and the Gloucester almost did not get its shot off in time. Riley confessed that when he first saw the radar blip, I believed I had 1 minute left to live. The puzzle was how he knew it was a Silkworm instead of an American A-6 aircraft. The Silkworm travels at around 600 to 650 knots, the same speed as the American A-6s as they return from bombing runs. Both are around the same size and present the same profile on the radar scopes. They are the same size because of all the explosive the Silkworm carries. It's about as large as a single-decker bus, large enough to devastate a Type 42 destroyer like the Gloucester. So we're going to get into the 4 ways to distinguish an American A-6 airplane from an Iraqi Silkworm missile. The first way is location. The Allied forces knew the location of the Iraqi Silkworm sites in the naval ships. Theoretically, the airplanes should return to aircraft carriers by pre-established routes, but the American pilots returning from bombing runs were cutting corners and flying over the Silkworm site in question. So all the previous day, they had done so. And even worse, the British Navy ships had recently moved closer to shore. So the pilots had not yet taken this changed position into account. The A-6s were crisscrossing paths with the Silkworm missiles. Radar is the second way to distinguish airplanes from missiles. The A-6s were fitted with identifiable radar, but most of them did not have their radar on when they were returning. The radar would make them more easily detectable by the enemy. The third way is a special system, Identify Friend or Foe, IFF, which allows an aircraft to be electronically interrogated to find out its status. Pilots obviously shut it down as they approach enemy territory because it would be a homing beacon for hostile missiles. They're supposed to switch it back on when they leave enemy territory so their own forces will know not to shoot them down, but after completing a bombing run and avoiding enemy defenses, many A-6 pilots were late in returning their IFF back on. Finally, altitude. The Silkworm would fly at around 1,000 feet, and the A-6s at around 2,000 to 3,000 feet. Therefore, altitude was the primary cue for identification, unless an A6 had damaged flaps and had to fly lower, but none had been seen coming in below 2,000 feet. Unfortunately, the Gloucester's 992 and 1022 radars do not give altitude information. In fact, it didn't have any radar that worked over land, so the first time it picked up a track was after the track went feet wet. I don't know. I guess that must be like military jargon. It flew off the coast and over the water. The radars sweep vertically through 360 degrees. All right, again, the writing here, the editor could have, added a word there. It feels I'm getting like the Israeli, ESL crap again. Whatever. So the radar sweeps 360 degrees in a circle until the radar operator spots a possible target. Only then can the Gloucester turn on the 909 radar that sweeps in horizontal bands to determine roughly the altitude of the target. So you can imagine like some radar dish spinning in a circle to figure out if there is a target somewhere in the line of sight, and then there's another second one that spins around in the area looking for which vertical band it lands in. You can imagine like when you have a plastic or like a fake Christmas tree, the different segments are at different heights, and it's like a cone. So it's like spinning in a cone to figure out which section of the tree it would land on, and that's how it finds vertical altitude. So it takes about 30 seconds to get altitude information after the 909 radar is turned on. So the first radar has to determine where it is horizontally, and it has to detect the target. And then the other one takes 30 seconds to determine its vertical altitude. Maddeningly, the Gloucester's weapons director failed in his first 2 attempts to type in the track number. First, because the track number was changed just before he typed it in, and next, he transposed the digits the second time. As a result, it was not until around 44 seconds into the incident that the 909 informed Riley that the target was flying at 1,000 feet. Only then did he issue the order to fire missiles at the track. Yet he had felt it was a silkworm almost from the instant he saw it, before the 909 radar was even initiated, and long before it gave him altitude information. Because there was no objective basis for his judgment, Riley confessed to us that he had to come to his conclusion through ESP. So, like from the gun, shooting from the hip, he knew it was a missile. So how could he have known that? Why was he so eager to shoot down this target that he was tracking? He just figured out its altitude 44 seconds in, and then gave the decision. But he was trained on it, and he was expecting it to be a missile like 5 seconds in. How did he know? You can see how little information there is here. To make matters worse, clouds of smoke from the burning oil fields were adhering to moisture in the air and obscuring the radars. The Gloucester's mission was to protect a small battle force, including the USS Missouri, whose guns were pounding the Kuwait coast, some minesweepers clearing the way for the ships to get closer, and a few other ships as well. The Missouri wanted to get closer to the coast, and on the day of the attack was only 20 miles off. And the closer it got, the less time the Gloucester had to react to a silkworm attack. So this was like the worst case scenario. And somehow he still, he clutched it. He pulled through. Riley told us about the background to the incident. The war was ending, with American-led forces driving up the coast toward Kuwait City. Soon, they would overrun the silkworm site. The constant shelling from the Missouri was also taking its toll. The Allies had also just flown a helicopter feint. Large numbers of helicopters launched off carriers staged a mock attack and then flew back. Riley had earlier run a mental simulation, putting himself in the minds of the Iraqi silkworm operators. If they didn't fire their missiles soon, they would lose any chance to ever fire them. There was nothing to save the missiles for, and for that, they had a nice fast target, the Missouri. If Riley was a silkworm operator, this was when he would fire his missiles. The Gloucester's crew had been working more than a month on 6-hour on, 6-hour off schedules. That meant 6 hours of staring at radar screens and then 6 hours to eat, perform other tasks, and grab some sleep. Fatigue had been building up during that time. Riley's shift had started at midnight, so his crew had been going for 5 hours. Because of Riley's imagining what he would do if he were running a silkworm site, he believed they were under greater risk than at any time earlier. Perhaps an hour before the attack, he warned his crew to be on their highest alert, because this was when the Iraqis were likely to fire them. So you can see he's piecing together the situation. He's putting all this together. He's not looking at the situation and immediately coming up with a decision. He had thought about this before. So this is part of his subconscious. This is part of his experience, and he's bringing this with him to the situation. You can't leave this out. Riley repeated his warning again, maybe at 4:55 a.m. That's like 5 minutes before the attack. As a result, the crew was ready when the missile came. When we pressed Riley about what he was noticing when he first spotted the radar blip, he said he knew it was a missile within the first 5 seconds. Since the radar sweep on the 922 is around 4 seconds, that means he identified it by the second sweep. Riley said he felt it was accelerating, almost imperceptibly. That was the clue. The A-6s flew at a constant speed. So the American planes, the A-6s, they were flying at a constant rate. They weren't accelerating. They weren't decelerating. They were just flying at the same rate, 500 to 600 knots. But this track seemed to be accelerating as it came off the coast. Fortunately, there were no other air tracks at the time, so he and his crew could give it their full attention. Otherwise, he doubts he would have noticed the acceleration. That should have wrapped things up, except after Riley left the interview, we discovered some inconsistencies in his account. First, he had no way to calculate acceleration until he saw at least 3 radar sweeps. He needed to compare the distance between sweeps 1 and 2 to the distance between sweeps 2 and 3 to see which was larger. But he had only seen 2. Even more troubling, there was no difference at all between the distance traveled by the track during its entire course. So it wasn't accelerating. Using objective measures, there was no indication of acceleration. We also wondered about Riley's sense that he knew it was a missile almost from the first contact. That first blip was recorded a little way off the coast because the ground clutter had masked the missile until it flew far enough over water. So we were talking about the smoke blocking the radar or interfering with it. Those signals were probably completely unusable. You probably couldn't tell if there was anything out there. And then, the missile had to fly off the coast and through the smoke, so over the water. This took 1 or 2 sweeps. Then the 992 radar picked up the track. What was there about that track that alerted Riley? We watched the tape again and again and again, trying to figure it out. Eventually, we succeeded. Rob Ellis from the Defense Research Agency at Farnborough realized what it was. Excuse me. Before reading on, this is a note to the reader, but basically he's telling you, do you guys know what it was? He's like asking you, do you know how he knew it was a missile? And the thing that should give you the clue, by the way, is the altitude and the lack of acceleration, but his clue is also that the smoke was only going up to a certain height, so keep that in mind. It was only obscuring the radar detections for the first 1,000, meters or feet? Yeah, 1,000 feet. So that's your clue. See if you can figure it out. Ellis tried to figure out why a track would look as if it was accelerating when really it was not, and before all the necessary information was in. He realized that the one difference between an A6 and a silkworm was altitude, 1,000 feet versus around 3,000 feet. Just as the track came off the coast, the track was masked by ground clutter. The Gloucester was 20 miles away. Ellis reasoned that the 992 radar would pick up a track flying at 3,000 feet earlier than one flying at 1,000 feet. The lower track would be masked by ground for a longer time. Maybe that meant that the higher tracks at 3,000 feet could be spotted on radar on the second radar sweep, after they went feet wet, whereas the silkworm flying at 1,000 feet would not give a radar return until the third radar sweep. So the first time you see it, it appears closer to you. It looks like it's like way faster, or it's like approaches faster than the other blips. So although the blips look the same and there's no way to tell the aircraft away from the missile, one of them shows up way closer to you. It looks like it's a lot faster. So that's what he means by acceleration. The Gloucester's crew and Riley were accustomed to the A6s. They knew the location of the silkworm site, and they were looking for a radar blip coming from that direction, at a certain distance off the coast. Instead, Riley saw a blip further off the coast than usual. That caught his attention and chilled him. The second radar return showed the usual distance for a track flying around 600 to 650 knots. Compared to how far that first track had come, it must have felt as if the track was moving really fast when it came off the coast. Then it seemed to slow down. Riley must have had a sense of great acceleration as he confounded altitude with speed. We asked Riley if he wanted to hear our hypothesis, and when we explained it, he agreed that we might have solved the riddle. So although the 992 radar does not scan for altitude, a skilled observer was able to infer altitude using the distance from the coast where the blip was first seen. In this example, as in the previous one, it is the mismatch or anomaly that the decision maker noticed. Perhaps such instances are difficult to articulate because they depend on a deviation from a pattern rather than the recognition of a prototype. So one little thing's off, or maybe a few things, but it's not quite right. It's like the uncanny valley. You can't really place where all of the inconsistencies are, but you just feel it. You just know that something's wrong. We've seen the use of intuition with firefighters and U.S. Navy officers, and each time the decision makers had trouble describing it. The next section illustrates the point using another domain, nursing. The infected babies. In this project, we studied the way nurses could tell when a very premature infant was developing a life-threatening infection. Beth Crandall, and that's Crandall. One of my coworkers had gotten funding from the National Institute of Health to study decision-making and expertise in nurses. She arranged to work with the nurses in the neonatal intensive care unit, the NICU, of a large hospital. These nurses cared for newly born infants who were premature or otherwise at risk. Beth found that one of the difficult decisions the nurses had to make was to judge when a baby was developing a septic condition, an infection. These infants weighed only a few pounds, some of them microbabies, less than 2 pounds. I didn't know that was a word, microbabies. When babies this small develop an infection, it can spread through their entire body and kill them before the antibiotics can stop it. Noticing the sepsis as quickly as possible is vital. Somehow the nurses in the NICU could do this. They could look at a baby, even a microbaby, and tell the physician when it was time to start the antibiotic. Sometimes the hospital would do tests and they would come back negative. Nevertheless, the baby went on antibiotics, and usually the next day the test would come back positive. This is the type of skilled decision-making that interests us the most. Yeah, so they can just look at a baby and figure out whether they need to give it, amoxicillin or whatever, like just by observing the baby before any tests are done. So that's pretty remarkable. In your lifetime, how many babies do you see? Like the average person, think about how many like newborns you see, and it's, I don't know, probably less than 20, probably around 10 newborns, like observing them more than like a stranger passing on the street and you just like glance at them. Like how many times have you observed a newborn? So these guys are experts. They probably see hundreds, thousands of babies, probably tens of thousands of newborns. So they're experts. It's the experience that sets them apart. That was even more interesting. Let me see. I skipped this part. Let me go back. So yeah, this is the type of skilled decision making that interests us the most. Beth began by asking the nurses how they were able to make these judgments. It's intuition, she was told, or else through experience. And that was that. The nurses had nothing more to say about it. They looked, they knew, and that was the end of the story. That was even more interesting. Expertise that the person clearly has, but cannot describe. Beth geared up the methods we had used with the firefighters. Instead of asking the nurses general questions such as, how did you make that judgment? She probed them on difficult cases where they had to use judgment skills. She interviewed nurses one at a time and asked each to relate a specific case where she had noticed an infant developing sepsis. The nurses could recall incidents, and in each case, they could remember the details of what had caught their attention. The cues varied from one case to the next, and each nurse had experienced a limited number of incidents. Beth compiled a master list of sepsis cues and patterns of cues in infants and validated it with the specialist in neonatology. Some of the cues were the same as those in the medical literature, but almost half of them were new, and some of the cues were opposite of the sepsis cues in adults. For instance, adults with infections tend to become more irritable. Premature babies, however, become less irritable. If a microbaby cried every time it was lifted up to be weighed, and then one day it did not cry, that would be a danger signal to an experienced nurse. Moreover, the nurses were not relying on any single cue. They often reacted to a pattern of cues, each one subtle, that together signaled an infant in distress. So like I was saying with the uncanny valley thing, you see the big picture. You see the whole baby as a synthesis of experience with it. You don't see like the baby being picked up and it not crying. You see the whole synthesis of like your past experience, your interactions, how it behaved, what color is it? Like is the baby's skin gray? Is it breathing slower or faster? That sort of stuff. So it's in that instant, you're seeing the full picture, and that's what gives you that sensation. It's not that one cue. It's like the sum of all the cues from before. Let me turn on a light in here. It's getting a little dark. Some of the costs of field research. The project with the NICU nurses was draining for our staff. The problem was not solely the minor shocks of inadvertently witnessing distressing medical procedures or the strain of seeing such tiny babies struggling to survive. It was the strain in the nurses themselves. More than half of the nurses interviewed cried at some point as they recalled infants who had not made it, signs they should have seen but missed, and even babies who had close calls. None of our other studies were as emotionally demanding as this one. Other studies posed their own challenges. Once we had a chance to observe and interview the command staff of a Forest Service team trying to bring a forest fire under control that had spread over 6 mountains in Idaho. One member of the research team was Marvin Thordson. In Idaho, Marvin was attached to a team in charge of the fire on one of the mountains. He dutifully tagged along, listening and looking agreeable. After a few days of this, Marvin was sitting in on one of their planning meetings. The team got to an issue and realized that they had already made this decision several days ago, but no one could remember what they decided. Marvin could only listen so long before he broke down. Knowing that he was violating the creed of observers, just to watch and never to intervene, he flipped back a few pages in his notebook and read to them what their plan had been. Jaws dropped open as the team found out how helpful it is to have someone serving as their official memory. By the end of this stint with the Forest Service, he was included as part of the planning team. Before finishing their meetings, they would ask him if he had anything to add. So observation. He's hammering home how important it is to be aware of your surroundings, to analyze your environment, to pick up on every cue that you feel, you see, you hear, you touch. It's about experiencing the world around you and synthesizing new ideas about it, or at least committing it to memory. At the very least, you're just remembering those things. And that's to say knowledge is power. That's what he's telling you. Marvin was a witness when another member of our research team, Chris Brezovic, tear gassed himself during our study of tank platoon leaders being trained at Fort Knox, Kentucky. As their training scenario was winding down, Chris was standing with one of the instructors, a sergeant. Part of the exercise was to train the platoon leaders to don their protective gear quickly in case of chemical weapons. As the sergeant tossed out several canisters of tear gas, the wind shifted. It collected the tear gas and lifted up in a cloud that began to move slowly toward Chris and the sergeant, neither of them with gas masks or protective gear. Chris knew about tear gas, and his first impulse was to run away while there was still time. But the sergeant was standing firm, and Chris decided that he did not want to be the first one to run. The sergeant decided that he didn't want to look like a coward in front of the observers either. So they both stayed until neither of them could stay anymore. They both stayed where they were while the cloud got closer. As the cloud floated directly overhead, the wind plunged the tear gas down at them. They tried to run, but it was too late. They collapsed, coughing uncontrollably, their faces covered with tears and mucus. In terms of pure adrenaline rush, I don't think any of our experiences can exceed the time we were studying airport baggage screeners to understand how they interpreted the X-ray images. Their difficult job is to identify weapons that may be rotated in any direction and may be superimposed on other metal objects. They need to make the judgment in only a few seconds. During this project sponsored by the Federal Aviation Administration, the FAA, two of our researchers, Steve Wolf and Dave Klinger, traveled to Cleveland to observe and conduct interviews. Approximately 10 minutes after they arrived at the checkpoint, a baggage screener saw something suspicious in the bag that a large, expensively dressed man had sent through the machine. The baggage screener did not know it was a gun. If she had, she would have locked it into the machine. She asked the man if she could open the bag. Security guards were summoned and quickly confiscated a gun, then led the man out in handcuffs. Our stunned researchers looked out in amazement. The odd part of the story is that the man had not intended to smuggle the weapon at all. He was carrying drugs and had forgotten to remove his .38 when he arrived at the airport. So he forgot his .38 special in the bag because he was doing too much dope. Don't get high on your own supply, guys. And don't bring a gun to the airport. But anyways, I don't know. I really don't know why that part was relevant to the story. I read through this and skimmed this earlier, and I was like, why is this covered? I don't know. I guess he's like opining on his research days. But anyways, we're going to read about the applications and the... Is there a section for this? No, there's not. Okay, well, we're just going to read about the applications of intuition. So this is like the last couple of paragraphs, and then we'll be done. The part of intuition that involves pattern matching and recognition of familiar and typical cases can be trained. If you want people to size up situations quickly and accurately, you need to expand their experience base. One way is to arrange for a person to receive more difficult cases. A fireground commander in a small rural community may get little direct experience. In contrast, firefighters in a large city with many old buildings can get a tremendous amount of experience in a short time. Another approach is to develop a training program, perhaps with exercises and realistic scenarios, so the person has a chance to size up numerous situations very quickly. A good simulation can sometimes provide more training value than direct experience. A good simulation lets you stop the action, back up to see what went on, and cram many trials together so a person can develop a sense of typicality. So again, it's not one example, and it's not one feature, it's the synthesis of all features. That's why knowing more things about the same situation is better than just like having someone tell you about it, or reading up on it later, or experiencing just a part of it. It's about the whole situation. It's about gathering as much information as you can and synthesizing it, putting the relevant pieces together, making judgments and associating the correct things with each other. Another training strategy is to compile stories of difficult cases and make these the training materials. In the NICU project, when Beth Crandall showed her findings to the nurse manager of the unit, the woman asked if Beth would present the cues to nurses on the unit in a training program. Beth objected that all the items on the list of critical cues had come from the nurses themselves. The head nurse was not deterred. Because this type of perceptual expertise was not getting shared or compiled, it was a particularly hard thing for new nurses on the unit to master. Yeah, you can imagine. She was saying that some nurses could just look at babies and figure out that they were experiencing an infection before a test would even show up positive. So if you were relying on the test, you were too late usually. So how do you go from one nurse who has tons of experience and can just look at a baby and figure out, like, what is the cue? How do I know that this baby's sick? And give that knowledge and hand that down and like pass that down to like someone who's completely new to the NICU, who's completely new to diagnosing babies with sepsis. How do you do that? And she's saying that literally just pass down the stories and pass down the cues of experts. Ask all the experts, what were their cues? How did they know that something was wrong? Compile them, generate an analysis, and find the cues that have overlap and are reproducible across different nurses, and then use that alongside stories to generate new analyses for novices. Allow novices to skip the experience part and just get right to the meat of it. This is like, what is a sick baby? What are the features of a sick baby? So like when you hear about like, what are the warning signs of a heart attack? It's like, that's from observing like thousands of people with heart attacks and finding the unique features of heart attack victims. No one just goes like, oh, I'm having a heart attack. It's because my blood pressure's up and my hands are numb and my skin's a little gray and I have pain in my chest. That must mean I have a heart attack. No one just figures that out one day. No one just associates those things because there's a lot of other things going on at the time. They're observing a lot of different stimuli. There's a lot of different cues going on. You might associate something completely irrelevant with your heart attack, like my eye started hurting or like I had a headache earlier that day. Maybe that's not a sign of a heart attack, but that's just what like one person had that day, and you have to like factor that out. So you can only do that through thousands of examples, and that's how you like speed run. That's how you like get someone. You give them experience. Is just provide them with the analysis, the synthesis of all those examples. But anyways. Another project that Beth performed involved the study of myocardial infarction. That doesn't sound right, but whatever. Myocardial infarction, commonly known as heart attacks. We've been working in the area of cardiopulmonary resuscitation to investigate how paramedics develop perceptual skills. The paramedics we interviewed said they could judge whether the person was actually having a heart attack or just suffering from indigestion. They also said that they could tell when a person was going to have a heart attack, days or even months ahead. At first, we didn't give this much thought. It sounded like the commanders who insisted they had ESP. After we heard it from more than one source, we paid attention. For instance, a paramedic described a family gathering where she saw her father-in-law for the first time in many months. "I don't like the way you look," she said. "Well, you don't look so great yourself," was his answer. "No, I really don't like the way you look," she continued. "We're going to the hospital." He grudgingly agreed to go the next day, but she insisted they go right then. An examination showed a blockage to a major artery. By the next day, he was having surgery to clear the blockage. Many of us view the heart like a balloon. A person is walking along just fine, and then something snags the balloon and the person goes down with a heart attack. This metaphor is not accurate. The heart is a pump with thick muscular walls. It doesn't burst like a balloon. Instead, it clogs up like a pump. Sometimes it clogs up quickly, as when a clot lodges somewhere. And when it clogs up slowly during congestive heart failure, there are signs. Areas of the body that are less important get less blood. By knowing what they are and by being alert to patterns in several of these areas, you can detect a problem in advance. The skin gets less blood and turns grayish. That is one of the best signs. The wrists and ankles show swelling. The mouth can look greenish. Our interviews with physicians, paramedics, and others turned up these indicators and several others. We also scanned the literature and verified our list of critical cues with specialists. Perceptual cues can be defined. This expertise does not have to remain in the realm of the specialist or in the intuition of the nurse or paramedic who has seen similar cases. Okay, he's telling you something very important. Knowledge does not reside in experts. And you can have the same knowledge that an expert has. That's what he's telling you. He's telling you that you can bypass the experience. You can bypass all the training and just learn from the cues. Now, that's not to say that it's better than the experience, and that's not to say it would replace it. But he's telling you that you can have the same knowledge an expert has. You can become basically like what would you call it? Like an ad hoc expert. You can become sort of an expert, I don't want to say pseudo, because you technically have the same cues the expert would. You just don't have the variety to know the negative cues or all the different variations of experiences, the variance. But he's telling you something important. He's like, if you learn from the experts, you can bypass all their experience. You can skip the line. You can jump to the front of the line. You don't have to spend years in the NICU studying what every baby looks like. You can just learn from the synthesis of all those experiences, what was distilled from that, and get the most important 5 details about what a sick baby looks like. So that is something to ponder on and think about. And it also kind of makes things hard to learn. How do you distinguish what is the most important information? How do you distinguish what is the distillation? What is the final result of all those experiences? What would you take away from that? What analysis would give you the best indicators or cues for you to become like the experts? So you'll have to think about that the next time you have an experience and you want to learn something from it. It's like, what do I take away from this? And maybe you have to experience the thing more. Maybe you have to just be in that situation more. One of the things that people tell you all the time to face your fears is to expose yourself to it. That's like cognitive behavioral therapy. That's like CBT. One of the core tenets is to slowly, oh my God, the word's escaping me. Slowly expose. It's called exposure therapy. Slowly expose yourself to some stimuli that causes fear and nervousness. And eventually, if you do your analysis, if you're cognizant about it and you really try to think about the experience afterwards and how it was actually safe or it actually wasn't as bad as you thought it would be, the fears kind of subside. It's also part of like a desensitization of the stimuli. It's like part of it is like your brain realizing that it doesn't have to work itself up, and you do become desensitized to things, the same stimulus over and over. That's behavioral. That's like part of the brain that you don't control. But the other part is the conscious part. The other part is the analyzing part. So if you can expose yourself to something that you don't like, or you're not good at, or that you're afraid of, like public speaking, you can just make yourself not afraid of it anymore. You can come to understand it. You can come to take the cues of experts, and you can become an expert yourself without having to go through the painful 10,000 hours of becoming an expert. You can fast track most of that. And that's not to, like I said before, it's not to replace it, and it's not to like say that those 10,000 hours weren't valuable. They have value. But what if you could just take the top 10 things that expert would do and do them right? You're probably already better than like 90% of the non-experts. You're probably like in the top 10 percentile. So keep that in mind. You putting yourself in outside of your comfort zone, exposing yourself to certain situations that you wouldn't normally do, to sort of like become an expert in it, expanding your comfort zone, like just making yourself comfortable with a different variety of things that you wouldn't normally do or experience, just makes you a more well-rounded person, and you can become an expert very quickly if you learn from that, and I guess combine that with the experience of experts. Take your own experience and then use that alongside the analysis of experts and combine the two. Make a synthesis of the two. That's probably the best way to do it without having your own 10,000 hours. So perceptual cues can be defined. The experts do not have to remain in the realm of the expertise does not have to remain in the realm of the specialist or in the intuition of the nurse or paramedic. It should be possible to train ordinary citizens to look at each other and recognize when a friend or coworker is starting to show the signs of impending heart problems. He's reiterating what I just said. Ordinary, average people can learn to become experts, or at least behave like an expert would to a certain extent. Hugh Wood, Program Chair for Emergency Incident Policy and Analysis Curriculum, and Carol Bouma, Instructional Design Specialist at the Federal Emergency Management Agency and the National Fire Academy, have been seen using the RPD model to revamp the Academy's curriculum in order to supply commanders more training in pattern matching and in recognizing situations. In the U.S. Marine Corps, Lieutenant General Paul Van Riper has guided organizations such as the Marine Corps Combat Development Command at Quantico, Virginia, to support intuitive decision-making. The Marines are beginning to use rapid pattern matching exercises developed by Major John Schmidt of the U.S. Marine Corps Reserves and other officers. In both places, the emphasis on pattern matching seemed more useful than lessons on formal analysis of alternate options. So yeah, capping it off, that you don't have time in the real world, in the field, for analysis all the time. It's most of the time you don't have time for analysis. So the best you can do is recognizing the situation from some experience or some cues and matching that to some solution or some other situation where it was solved. So recognition and then action. And obviously in the chart, in the Jumbotron, there's a part where you have to imagine yourself in the situation first. Otherwise, you may act on an I guess you may come up with a solution and then not imagine yourself in it, and then it may be the wrong decision. So part of that is to imagine yourself in the situation first. So if you come up with a solution, try and imagine how it would fail, how it would work out if you actually carried out that solution. And you can do that rather quickly. So That's how that chart is useful. That's telling you how to become an expert. So, how to become an expert through intuition. But anyways, that's the space. That's chapter 4. I'm going to be doing the next one probably next Tuesday if nothing else changes. So chapter 5, let me see what the title is. The Power of Mental Simulation. So he obviously left out the part of his chart where you imagine yourself in the situation. He's talking about recognition. He's talking about action. He's talking about cues. Now he's going to be talking about mental simulation. So this is the part where you imagine the solution. You imagine the action before you carry it out. So we'll read that next time, and I'll probably post some figures beforehand. I'll post the space beforehand so you guys get the notification. But thanks for listening. Thanks for tuning in. Have a good rest of your night, guys, and I will catch you next time.